Tonight, we uncover a story buried beneath centuries of faith, a rivalry older than any religion, and a secret that may change everything we think we know about divine power. They say the walls of Rome hold every secret, but some are buried far deeper, and you're about to walk down corridors that most Vatican employees don't even know exist, corridors where the air itself tastes like parchment and privilege, where every footstep echoes against stone that witnessed emperors fall and popes rise. And if we're being honest here, you probably won't survive this, at least not without falling asleep somewhere around section 3, which is exactly what we're hoping for. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to drop a comment, letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are, because there's something oddly comforting about knowing we're all scattered across time zones, yet gathered here in this moment, united by curiosity and the desperate need for sleep that actually feels restorative. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing at a nondescript door in the Vatican's Apostolic Archive, formerly called the Secret Archive, until someone in public relations realized that secret was doing them no favors in the transparency department, and the Swiss guard stationed here, resplendent in his Renaissance costume that somehow commands respect, despite looking like he raided a very specific theatrical wardrobe, nods almost imperceptibly as you present credentials that took months to acquire, credentials that grant you access to documents concerning the Knights Templar, that legendary order of warrior monks who built an empire on faith and finance before collapsing in a single day of coordinated arrests, that still makes historians whisper about state power and conspiracy. The door opens with a sound like a sigh, as though the building itself is reluctant to reveal what lies beyond, and you descend a staircase where each step down seems to take you back a century, the temperature dropping degree by degree, until you can see your breath forming small clouds in the dim lighting provided by LED strips that feel almost sacrilegious in their modernity, illuminating shelves that stretch into shadows and hold over 53 miles of shelving. According to the Vatican's own estimates, though scholars debate whether that measurement includes the sections that officially don't exist. Your guide, a cheerful archivist named Father Benedetto, who speaks 7 languages and makes jokes about medieval Latin puns that absolutely no one else finds funny, leads you past documents signed by Charlemagne, past letters from Michelangelo complaining about payment delays with an artistic temperament that would feel right at home on modern social media, past the actual papal bull from 1312 that officially dissolved the Templar order, and you notice how the ink has faded to a brown that matches the stains you hope are just from ancient wine spills. Here, Father Benedetto says, gesturing to a particular shelf with the pride of someone showing off a beloved but slightly embarrassing relative, are the Chinon parchment findings discovered in 2001, which revealed that Pope Clement V actually absolved the Templar leaders of heresy charges in 1308, though he still let King Philip IV of France execute them anyway, because apparently medieval politics required such compromises, and he delivers this information with the kind of dry humor that makes you suspect centuries of working with church bureaucracy have given him perspectives he can't quite voice in official documents. The mainstream historical fact everyone agrees on is that the Knights Templar were founded around 1119 by a French knight named Hugues de Payens and 8 companions who took vows to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem during the Crusades, receiving papal endorsement in 1129 at the Council of Troyes, and within decades transforming from a small band of devout warriors into the medieval world's first international banking system, creating letters of credit that allowed pilgrims to deposit funds in Europe and withdraw them in the Holy Land, without carrying dangerous amounts of gold across bandit-infested roads, essentially inventing an early form of checks and wire transfers while wearing armor and taking vows of chastity. But here's a quirky tidbit that doesn't make it into most textbooks. Some Templar properties in France featured architectural elements including mysterious head carvings and symbols that certain researchers interpret as evidence of Baphomet worship or secret Gnostic practices, though mainstream historians argue these were likely misunderstood artistic choices or later additions. And honestly, the whole Baphomet thing probably says more about what their enemies wanted people to believe than what the Templars actually did during their downtime between banking and crusading. You run your fingers along the edge of a manuscript, gently, because Father Benedetto's pleasant demeanor definitely masks someone who would personally excommunicate you for damaging a document, and you notice the handwriting, still crisp after 7 centuries, describing Templar rituals that required initiates to kiss the base of the spine, the navel, and the mouth of their inducting officer. practices that medieval inquisitors found scandalous, but which scholars debate were either genuine fraternity bonding rituals, common to military orders of the period, evidence of actual heterodox practices, or confessions extracted under torture, and therefore completely unreliable. The air down here smells like time itself. If time had a scent, mixing dust and old leather, and something vaguely floral that might be the special preservation treatment applied to particularly fragile pages, and the silence is so complete you can hear Father Benedetto's stomach gurgle softly, a reminder that even priests who guard history's most controversial secrets still need lunch. You ask him the question everyone wants answered: where's the treasure? Where did the Templar wealth go when the order fell? And he laughs, a sound that echoes off stone walls before getting absorbed by thousands of documents, and he tells you that's exactly the wrong question, that focusing on gold and silver misses the real treasure, which was knowledge, connections, financial innovations, and secrets about the true origins of Christian relics that could shake faith itself if revealed. The thing about the Vatican archives is that they're not really designed to hide things, but rather to preserve them until the world is ready. Or at least that's the official line. Though you notice certain cataloging systems seem deliberately obtuse, creating layers of bureaucracy that effectively hide documents by making them nearly impossible to request without already knowing they exist. A kind of security through obscurity that would impress any modern IT department. Father Benedetto shows you a letter, dated 1314, written by a Templar knight awaiting execution, and the handwriting wavers between steady confidence and obvious tremors, describing how the order's mission was never really about Jerusalem, but about preserving ancient wisdom from Solomon's temple, wisdom that allegedly included everything from sacred geometry to theological truths that predated Christianity itself, claims that open scholarly debate continues to examine regarding whether Templars genuinely believed they possessed pre-Christian knowledge, or whether later Romantic movements simply projected these ideas backward. The candles flicker. Yes, there are actual candles down here alongside the LED strips, because apparently some traditions matter, even in climate-controlled archives, and you feel the weight of all this history pressing down from above, literally millions of documents sitting on shelves overhead, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of human belief, ambition, and the endless complicated relationship between spiritual faith and temporal power, and you're starting to understand why this particular story makes such perfect bedtime material, because it's essentially about trying to find truth in an ocean of competing narratives where everyone involved had reasons to lie, exaggerate, or conveniently forget inconvenient facts. You emerge from the archives with your head full of questions, and Father Benedetto's cheerful reminder that the cafeteria closes in 20 minutes if you want actual food rather than philosophical sustenance, and you find yourself walking through Rome at dusk, past the Colosseum where you can almost hear ghostly crowds cheering for entertainment that involved significantly more violence than reality television, though the basic premise of watching people's lives fall apart for public consumption remains oddly consistent, and you're thinking about how the Templars rose from nothing to become the medieval equivalent of a multinational corporation, combined with special forces, combined with the Federal Reserve, all while maintaining vows of poverty that somehow didn't prevent the order itself from accumulating massive wealth, a contradiction that made perfect sense in medieval logic, where individual poverty and collective prosperity weren't seen as conflicting values. The Knights Templar began their ascent in 1119, or possibly 1118 depending on which chronicle you trust, and whether you're using the modern calendar or the medieval reckoning that considered years starting on different dates depending on region. When Hugues de Payens and his 8 companions approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem and offered to protect pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads to holy sites, and the king, who probably appreciated any help he could get in managing an unstable Crusader kingdom surrounded by hostile territories, gave them headquarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, a location that gave them their name and sparked centuries of speculation about what they might have discovered, excavating beneath that ancient site. You walk past the Tiber River, watching it flow with the same indifferent persistence it showed when Templar ships sailed from Mediterranean ports carrying goods, pilgrims, and secrets, and you consider the mainstream historical fact that by 1150, the Templars had become so influential that they owned properties across Europe and the Holy Land, operated a fleet of ships, maintained fortresses that doubled as banks, and answered to no authority except the Pope himself, creating a parallel power structure that made kings nervous and depositors confident, because an organization that served God directly seemed like a safer bet for your money than some local monarch who might decide to solve budget problems through creative confiscation. The moon rises over Rome, nearly full, the same moon that illuminated Templar knights riding toward battle at the Horns of Hattin in 1187, a disastrous defeat where Saladin's forces destroyed the Crusader army and captured the true cross, though historians debate whether the relic was actually authentic or one of several competing true crosses circulating in medieval markets where supply of holy relics seemed to mysteriously match demand, and you can almost picture those white-mantled warriors, with their distinctive red crosses, fighting with a fanaticism born from believing they were literally God's chosen instruments, which is either deeply inspiring or deeply terrifying depending on your perspective regarding absolute certainty in any ideology. You stop at a cafe because you need caffeine to process all this, even though caffeine and bedtime stories don't traditionally mix, but we're going for a gentle alertness here, a state where you're aware enough to follow the narrative but relaxed enough that sleep will come easily once we finish. And the barista makes eye contact that suggests she's judging your decision to order espresso at this hour, a look that probably hasn't changed much since medieval Roman innkeepers served wine to Templar emissaries conducting banking business after sunset. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. Some Templar churches, including the famous Temple Church in London, were built in a circular design mimicking the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and during renovations in Victorian times, workers discovered the preserved bodies of medieval knights in stone coffins, with one skeleton showing evidence of what appears to be a crossbow bolt wound, suggesting someone died violently, despite the church being a supposedly peaceful sanctuary. Though whether this was battle, assassination, or a particularly intense theological disagreement remains unknown, and honestly probably unknowable at this point. The Templars' banking system worked through a network of commanderies, fortified complexes, serving as farms, training centers, and financial offices, spread across Europe like an early version of bank branches, and pilgrims would deposit valuables at one location, receive an encrypted letter detailing the amount, and withdraw equivalent value at their destination, with the Templars taking a modest fee for the service, while also earning returns on investing the deposited capital in everything from agricultural improvements to maritime trade, creating a financial engine that made them indispensable to kings who needed loans to fund wars, crusades, or palace renovations that would impress visiting dignitaries. You finish your espresso and leave exact change because you're not a monster, and you continue walking through streets that narrow into medieval passages where the buildings lean toward each other like old friends sharing secrets, and you're contemplating how the Templars embodied a contradiction that medieval society somehow accepted but modern minds find puzzling. They were monks who killed, bankers who prayed, and warriors who were supposed to represent humility while living in fortresses that projected unmistakable power. By the late 1200s, the Templars had become so wealthy that they effectively served as the French royal treasury, holding King Philip IV's money and managing his accounts, arrangement that seemed convenient until Philip found himself deeply in debt to the order, owing sums he couldn't possibly repay without either spectacular military victories, bringing in plunder, or some dramatic intervention that would eliminate the debt entirely. And you can probably see where this is heading, though the historical details involve more complexity than a simple debt cancellation scheme, because medieval politics always involved layers of motivation that made modern conspiracy theories look straightforward by comparison. The scholarly debate continues regarding whether the Templars actually discovered something beneath the Temple Mount during their early years in Jerusalem: ancient scrolls, lost relics, buried treasure, or knowledge that gave them leverage over the church itself, with some researchers pointing to the order's remarkably rapid rise in influence and papal favor as evidence that they possessed something valuable beyond military capability, while mainstream historians argue that papal support came primarily from genuine religious enthusiasm, combined with the practical need for professional soldiers in the Holy Land, and that speculation about secret discoveries says more about our modern desire for conspiracy than medieval reality. You pass a small church, no tourists at this hour, just shadows and the faint smell of incense from earlier services, and you remember reading that Templars attended religious services 8 times daily, their lives structured around prayer, even while managing international finance and military operations. And you try to imagine the mental compartmentalization required to transition from morning prayers to afternoon loan negotiations to evening weapons training, all while maintaining genuine spiritual devotion, or at least maintaining the appearance of it, because whether every Templar was a true believer, or whether some were essentially career soldiers and bankers in religious costume, is another question historians gently disagree about over academic conferences. The Temple Church in London, built by the Templars around 1185, survived the Great Fire of 1666 and the Blitz during World War II, sitting there through centuries as a stone reminder of an order that no longer exists, and visitors today can see the round nave with its marble columns and the stone effigies of knights in full armor, their hands clasped in prayer, their feet resting on lions or dragons in symbolic poses that probably meant something specific to medieval viewers, but require explanation for modern tourists. And honestly, there's something both touching and unsettling about seeing these carved faces of men who believed they were serving eternal truth, while being caught in very temporal political machinery that would eventually crush them. You think about how the Templars' military reputation was built on discipline and tactics that made them formidable despite often being outnumbered, including their famous refusal to retreat unless outnumbered more than 3-1, a policy that demonstrated either remarkable courage or remarkable inflexibility depending on the specific battle, and their white mantles with red crosses became symbols that struck fear in Muslim armies and reassurance in Christian pilgrims, though cynics might note that strong branding has always been crucial to institutional success, whether you're selling salvation or securities. The Templars' downfall was already being written in their success, because any institution that powerful inevitably creates enemies among those who feel threatened, and by the early 1300s, you had a French king desperate for money, a pope who owed his position partly to that same king's political support, and an order whose warrior-monk purpose had become ambiguous after the fall of Acre in 1291, ended the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, leaving the Templars as an extremely wealthy military organization without a clear military mission, which is rarely a sustainable position in any era. You wake up Friday morning, October 13th, 1307, or rather you imagine waking up as a Templar knight in Paris on that particular morning, and everything seems normal, the kind of normal where you've attended dawn prayers, and you're thinking about the administrative tasks ahead, maybe some correspondence about property transfers, or reviewing accounts from the commandery's farming operations, definitely not thinking that today will become so infamous that centuries later, people will consider Friday the 13th unlucky, specifically because of what's about to happen to you and every other Templar in France. The dawn light filters through narrow windows in the Paris Temple, the order's massive fortress that served as headquarters, treasury, and royal bank, and you can hear the usual sounds of morning in a large complex footsteps in corridors, the clatter of the kitchen preparing breakfast, distant murmur of prayers from the chapel, and absolutely nothing suggests that King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair for his looks rather than his justice, has spent weeks planning a coordinated operation that will simultaneously arrest nearly every Templar in France on identical charges delivered via sealed orders that royal officials opened only at dawn this morning. The mainstream historical fact that no one disputes is that on Friday, October 13, 1307, King Philip IV of France ordered the arrest of all Templars in his kingdom, on charges including heresy, idol worship, homosexual practices, and spitting on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies, with the arrests carried out simultaneously across France through sealed orders sent to royal officials weeks in advance, demonstrating a level of coordinated state action that was remarkably sophisticated for the medieval period and set a precedent for how absolute monarchs would later suppress organizations they deemed threatening. You're drinking something, water, weak ale, whatever passes for morning beverages in 1307, when the doors burst open and royal soldiers pour in, and there's a moment of confusion because Templars are trained warriors, accustomed to combat, but these soldiers carry the king's authority, and the whole situation doesn't make sense yet. Why would the king whose treasury you literally guard suddenly treat you like criminals? And the answer involves debts and power, and the complicated fact that Philip needed money badly enough to destroy his creditors rather than repay them, though historians debate whether financial motivation was primary or whether genuine concern about heresy played a larger role than cynical modern interpretations suggest. Here's your quirky historical tidbit. According to some accounts, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, was scheduled to be a pallbearer at a royal funeral just days before his arrest, suggesting that right up until the moment of betrayal, the Templars believed they maintained good relations with the French crown, which either speaks to remarkable royal deception or remarkable Templar naivete, and honestly both explanations seem plausible, given what we know about medieval politics, where friendly dinners and political executions could be separated by surprisingly short intervals. The arrests happen quickly, you're bound, searched, confined, and within hours, thousands of Templars across France find themselves imprisoned in royal dungeons, their property seized, their records confiscated, and their bewilderment probably profound, because even if you suspected your order had enemies, the scale and coordination of this takedown suggests planning that went on while you were conducting business as usual, managing farms, and counting coins, and attending prayer services, completely unaware that sealed orders describing you as a heretic were already written and waiting for the appointed hour. The charges read like a greatest hits compilation of medieval anxieties: worshipping a mysterious head called Baphomet, denying Christ, engaging in obscene kisses during secret rituals, and generally practicing the sort of things that would definitely get you burned at the stake if proven. And whether any of these charges were true remains one of those scholarly debates that will probably never be fully resolved, because the evidence consists largely of confessions extracted under torture, and as any modern legal system acknowledges, people will confess to almost anything if you hurt them enough, including impossible crimes and obvious fabrications. You imagine being interrogated, the stone cell, the implements of persuasion, the inquisitors who genuinely believe they're serving God by extracting truth through pain, and you understand why Templars started confessing to the charges, describing rituals that sound either like genuine heterodox practices or like exactly what interrogators wanted to hear, depending on your interpretation, and the fact that many Templars later recanted their confessions when torture stopped, only to be tortured again until they confirmed the original statements, tells you something about the reliability of the evidence, but apparently didn't concern medieval justice systems operating under different evidentiary standards than modern courts would accept. The scholarly debate continues about what actually happened during Templar initiation ceremonies, with possibilities ranging from completely orthodox religious rituals that were misrepresented by hostile witnesses, to fraternity hazing practices that seemed normal within military culture but looked scandalous to outsiders, to genuine alternative theological beliefs that would have indeed qualified as heresy under Catholic doctrine. And the truth might involve elements of all three, because any organization operating for 2 centuries across different countries would inevitably develop regional variations and internal diversity that simple narratives can't capture. You think about Grand Master Jacques de Molay, arrested at age 63 after dedicating his entire adult life to the order, finding himself imprisoned and pressured to confess, eventually admitting to spitting on the cross during his own initiation 40 years earlier, a confession he later recanted before recanting the recantation, his vacillations suggesting either a man genuinely uncertain about what happened decades ago, or someone trying to navigate impossible political pressure through strategic admissions and denials. And honestly, both interpretations seem plausible and probably both contain truth. The trials drag on for years, because medieval legal processes moved with the speed of bureaucracy combined with theological debate, and witnesses testify to seeing Templars worship a head, or a cat, or perform nighttime rituals involving nudity and sacrilege, testimony that ranges from possibly genuine accounts of something unusual to obvious fantasy, to deliberate fabrication, and separating these categories after 7 centuries is essentially impossible, leaving historians to argue over emphasis and interpretation, while acknowledging the evidence is hopelessly contaminated by torture, political pressure, and the unreliability of medieval record-keeping. Pope Clement V, who owed his position partly to Philip's political support, initially tried to maintain some independence by conducting his own investigation, and the Chinon parchment discovered in the Vatican archives in 2001 revealed that papal investigators in 1308 actually absolved the Templar leadership of heresy after private questioning, finding their practices odd, but not heretical. But Clement lacked the political power to actually protect the Templars from Philip's determination to destroy them, so the papal absolution remained secret, while the public trials continued toward their predetermined conclusion, demonstrating that even medieval popes couldn't always control outcomes when powerful kings had other ideas. You watch, historically speaking, as the Templars burn. 54 Templars were burned at the stake in Paris in a single day in May 1310, and the smell of burning flesh drifts across the city while crowds gather to watch heretics receive justice or innocent men die for political convenience, depending on your perspective, and the victims reportedly went to their deaths, maintaining their innocence and calling on God to witness the injustice, which is either the behavior of genuine martyrs or the last desperate claims of guilty men, and 7 centuries of scholarship hasn't definitively resolved which interpretation is correct. The final scene comes in March 1314, when Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny, the order's last Grand Master and preceptor of Normandy, are brought before a commission that expects them to confirm their confessions publicly, but instead both men recant everything, proclaiming their innocence and the order's innocence, declaring that their previous confessions were extracted through torture and fear, and Philip, who is present for this very public humiliation, orders them burned at the stake that same day, not bothering with further legal process because kings who have come this far don't typically reverse course, just because the condemned men change their stories. They burn on a small island in the Seine. You can still visit the approximate location, now called the Square du Ver Galant, and legend holds that Jacques de Molay cursed King Philip and Pope Clement from the flames, summoning them to meet him before God's judgment within a year, and whether he actually said this, or whether later chroniclers invented the curse to explain convenient timing, both Pope Clement V and King Philip IV did indeed die within a year, Clement in April 1314 and Philip in November 1314, which is either remarkable coincidence, divine justice, or simply the fact that both men were already in poor health, and the stress of destroying the Templars might have contributed to their decline, depending on whether you prefer supernatural or medical explanations for historical events. You stand in the aftermath, metaphorically speaking, surveying the wreckage of an order that controlled wealth, commanded respect, and seemed permanent until it vanished in a coordinated action that modern historians study as an early example of state power, crushing an international organization through legal and military means simultaneously, and you're wondering what survived, what the Vatican still guards in those climate-controlled archives, what secrets persist beyond the executions and confessions and official suppressions. The mainstream historical fact is that Pope Clement V officially dissolved the Knights Templar in 1312 at the Council of Vienne, through the papal bull Vox in Excelso, not on grounds that they were proven guilty, but citing scandal and the order's damaged reputation as making continuation impossible, a carefully worded document that avoided declaring the Templars heretical while still eliminating them, and the order's properties were theoretically transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, though in practice, many royal treasuries simply kept what they'd already seized, because medieval property transfers were more suggestion than strict legal requirement. You think about what happened to the Templars who survived. Some joined other military orders, some returned to secular life, some disappeared into history's anonymity, and some, according to Romantic tradition, fled to Scotland, Portugal, or other regions where royal authority was weaker and their skills might still find employment, though evidence for organized Templar continuation movements is sparse and largely consists of later organizations claiming Templar descent without convincing documentation, which hasn't stopped enthusiastic researchers from drawing elaborate charts connecting medieval knights to modern fraternal organizations. The treasure question persists because when French officials inventoried Templar properties, they found significantly less gold and silver than expected from an organization that had functioned as Europe's primary bank, leading to centuries of speculation about what happened to the wealth. Was it hidden, smuggled out before arrests, never as large as rumored, or simply absorbed into royal treasuries with minimal accounting? And the scholarly debate continues with positions ranging from, the treasure is a myth based on exaggerated estimates of Templar wealth, to something significant was definitely moved and hidden before the arrests, with the truth probably involving the usual historical answer of, it's complicated and different things happened in different locations. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the 1960s, treasure hunters using metal detectors and amateur archaeology dug up parts of the Templar commandery at Gisors in France, claiming they'd found evidence of a secret chapel and hidden chambers, though professional archaeologists examining the site found no definitive proof of treasure vaults. And the whole episode demonstrated how Templar legends inspire people to start digging centuries later, usually finding historical artifacts of modest value rather than the chests of gold and mystical relics that enthusiastic speculation suggests. You walk through the Vatican archives again, this time focusing on documents related to what the Templars might have actually believed, beyond the lurid accusations and forced confessions, and Father Benedetto shows you correspondence between Templar officials discussing everything from agricultural yields to theological questions about usury and just warfare, letters that reveal an organization struggling with the same tensions any institution faces between ideals and practical necessities, between spiritual purpose and financial obligations, between individual conscience and organizational loyalty. The scholarly debate about Templar beliefs and practices continues across multiple dimensions, whether their initiation rituals contained actual heterodox elements, or were orthodox practices misunderstood by outsiders, whether contact with Islamic scholarship influenced Templar theology in ways that would have seemed heretical to conservative Christianity, whether the order harbored Gnostic tendencies or remained firmly within Catholic orthodoxy, and whether the charges against them contained any truth or were pure political fabrication, with historians parsing the same limited evidence and reaching different conclusions based partly on evidence and partly on their prior assumptions about how institutions behave under pressure. You examine a letter dated 1310, written by a minor Templar knight to his family, smuggled out of prison somehow, and preserved by descendants until eventually finding its way to the Vatican through purchases and donations. And it describes his confusion and fear, his insistence that he never worshipped anything except Christ, his bewilderment at charges that seem completely disconnected from his daily life of managing an agricultural estate and attending chapel services. And reading this personal testimony centuries later gives you a perspective that official trial records can't provide, a reminder that historical events involved individual people with thoughts and feelings and families, not just abstract forces and institutional conflicts. The question of what the Vatican still guards comes down to how you interpret guards. These documents are preserved and accessible to serious researchers, not locked away in the sense that movies suggest, but they're protected by bureaucratic procedures that effectively limit access to scholars with specific credentials and research purposes. And whether this constitutes guarding secrets or simply maintaining archival standards depends on your level of conspiracy-mindedness, though you notice Father Benedetto doesn't show you everything in the Templar section and acknowledges that some documents remain restricted for various reasons, including preservation concerns, privacy issues regarding confessions, and yes, probably sensitivity about content that might embarrass the Church or fuel unhelpful speculation. The connection between Templars and later esoteric traditions is a historical rabbit hole involving Freemasons, Rosicrucians, and various occult movements that claim Templar descent or inherited Templar secrets, claims that mainstream historians generally dismiss as romantic fabrication, but which persist in alternative historical narratives. And honestly, the fact that the Templars failed so spectacularly and mysteriously makes them perfect vessels for later groups wanting to claim ancient legitimacy, because you can attribute almost anything to a suppressed order without much risk of contradiction from surviving Templars. You look at architectural drawings from Temple Church in London, noticing symbols that some researchers interpret as encoded messages and mainstream archaeologists see as standard medieval decoration, and you realize that after a certain point, what you see in these documents depends largely on what you're looking for. Whether you approach history as detective work, searching for hidden truths, or as scholarly analysis, examining evidence within context, and both approaches have value, though they rarely agree on conclusions regarding ambiguous materials. The Templar legacy persists in unexpected ways. Friday the 13th as unlucky. The international banking system's basic structure, military orders' organizational models, and the endless fascination with secret societies holding dangerous knowledge. And you realize that what the Vatican guards isn't necessarily physical treasure or shocking revelations, but rather the complex, contradictory human reality of an institution that was simultaneously devout and greedy, noble and corrupt, orthodox and possibly heterodox depending on which documents you emphasize and how you interpret evidence that often supports multiple conclusions. And maybe the real secret, just layers of historical complexity that resist the neat narratives we prefer when we're trying to fall asleep, but perhaps appreciate when we're awake enough to handle ambiguity. Though at this point in the script you're hopefully drifting towards sleep despite the intellectual content, your mind processing these medieval mysteries while your body relaxes into comfortable darkness, and Father Benedetto is gently suggesting that visiting hours are ending. The archives will close. You'll need to leave these documents to their climate-controlled silence until some future researcher arrives with different questions and perhaps different ways of interpreting the same evidence that has fascinated scholars for 7 centuries and will likely continue fascinating them for 7 more, because humans never tire of mysteries involving faith, power, treasure, and secret knowledge, especially when the organizations guarding these mysteries have every reason to maintain careful control over narratives that might challenge comfortable assumptions about religious authority and historical truth. You surface from the depths of this story like a diver coming up slowly to avoid the bends, and you find yourself wanting to piece together what we've actually learned about the Templars, about the Vatican's relationship with their memory, and about why this particular chapter of history still matters enough to spend 13,000 words examining in a format designed to help you sleep, which is either ironic or perfectly appropriate, depending on whether you think history's greatest value comes from exciting discovery or meditative contemplation. The Knights Templar emerged from the chaos of the First Crusade as a solution to a practical problem. Pilgrims needed protection, but they evolved into something unprecedented in medieval society, an organization that combined religious devotion with military power and financial innovation in ways that made them indispensable to kings and popes, while simultaneously threatening the established order through their independence, their wealth, and their loyalty to a mission that transcended national boundaries, creating the template for international organizations that would become common centuries later, but which seemed dangerously anomalous in the 1100s and 1200s, when power was supposed to flow through clear hierarchies of feudal obligation and royal authority. The historical significance of their rise and fall extends beyond the specific events to what it revealed about medieval power structures, about the relationship between spiritual and temporal authority, about how economic innovation can transform an institution's role in society, and about the limits of any organization's independence when it threatens those who control military force and legal systems. Lessons that remain relevant in analyzing how modern institutions navigate between their ideals and the practical requirements of operating in a world where power ultimately rests with whoever commands police forces and armies. However much we dress that reality in legal language and democratic procedures, what the Vatican still guards, in those climate-controlled archives where Father Benedetto maintains cheerful professionalism while managing access to controversial materials, includes documents that confirm some aspects of the traditional narrative while complicating others, evidence that the Templars were neither the pure holy warriors of romantic legend nor the depraved heretics of the trial accusations, but rather a complex organization containing genuine devotion and financial pragmatism, military courage and bureaucratic tedium, theological orthodoxy, and possibly some regional variations that made conservative church officials uncomfortable, all of which is precisely the kind of historical complexity that doesn't fit well into simple stories, but which feels appropriate to contemplate in these quiet hours, when you're drifting between wakefulness and sleep, between the part of your mind that demands clear answers, and the part that can accept mystery and ambiguity as permanent conditions of historical understanding. The scholarly debates we've touched on throughout this narrative, whether Templar rituals contained heterodox elements, whether they discovered something significant beneath the Temple Mount, whether their confessions contained truth or were entirely fabricated under torture, whether their wealth was hidden or simply absorbed by royal treasuries, whether their influence on later esoteric traditions was real or imaginary, these debates continue not because historians are stubborn or incompetent, but because the evidence genuinely supports multiple interpretations, and different scholars weigh the same facts differently based on their methodological approaches, their assumptions about human behavior under pressure, their assessment of medieval record reliability, and their comfort with acknowledging uncertainty when definitive proof is absent, which is actually more often than popular history admits, because we prefer confident narratives to honest acknowledgments of what we cannot know. You think back to that opening moment in Section 1, descending stairs into the Vatican archives, breathing air that tasted like parchment and privilege, and you realize that the physical descent served as a metaphor for this entire exploration, moving down through layers of history and interpretation, until you reached something solid, the actual documents, the preserved testimony, the architectural remains, but finding that even this foundation contains ambiguity, that solid historical fact turns out to include unexplained elements and contradictory accounts, that reaching the bottom of the stairs doesn't mean you've reached the bottom of the mystery, just that you've arrived at the level where mysteries can be examined more closely, without necessarily being solved. The Templars' lasting impact includes obvious legacies like Friday the 13th superstition and international banking structures, but also subtler influences on how we think about institutional power, religious authority, and the possibility that organizations might possess knowledge or capabilities that threaten established order, a theme that resonates through conspiracy theories about the Illuminati, the Federal Reserve, intelligence agencies, and any group suspected of operating behind the scenes with agendas that differ from their public mission. And while most specific conspiracy theories are nonsense, the Templar precedent reminds us that sometimes powerful organizations do operate with hidden purposes, do accumulate dangerous knowledge, and do eventually face suppression by authorities who find them inconvenient. So perhaps the paranoid style in historical thinking, while usually wrong in specifics, captures something true about how power works when you zoom out far enough to see patterns across centuries. You remember the sensory details we've accumulated: candlelight in archives, the Tiber flowing with medieval indifference, the smell of old parchment mixing with preservation chemicals, Father Benedetto's stomach gurgling in the profound silence, the imagined sounds of dawn on October 13th, 1307, when royal soldiers burst through doors and changed everything in a morning, the flames on the Seine where Jacques de Molay died, maintaining his innocence or his guilt, depending on which moment's testimony you credit. And these details serve not as historical evidence, but as anchors for understanding, ways of making the past feel tangible, when you're trying to comprehend events separated from you by 7 centuries of accumulated change and interpretation. The Vatican's role in this story shifts depending on perspective. They're the institution that preserved documents revealing papal absolution of Templar leaders, but also the institution that participated in the order's suppression. They're the guardians of historical records that enable research, but also the controllers of access to materials that might contain embarrassing or challenging content. They're the inheritors of a medieval church that made complex political compromises, and they're the modern institution trying to maintain credibility while acknowledging past errors without completely undermining their authority. A balancing act that would challenge any organization claiming moral leadership while possessing extensive documentation of their predecessors' morally ambiguous decisions. And honestly, the fact that they allow researchers access to these materials suggests more transparency than many powerful institutions demonstrate regarding their controversial history, even if the access comes with bureaucratic procedures and unacknowledged restrictions that researchers occasionally complain about in academic footnotes. As you prepare to transition from this historical exploration toward sleep, you might reflect on what drew you to this particular story tonight. Perhaps the allure of hidden knowledge, perhaps fascination with how institutions rise and fall, perhaps simple curiosity about why the Vatican would still guard documents about an order suppressed 7 centuries ago, perhaps just the hope that a long, detailed, gently delivered historical narrative might quiet the mind's usual anxious chatter and create space for rest. And whatever your reason, you've now traveled from Vatican archives through Templar history and back again, accumulating images and facts and questions that your sleeping mind might process in ways your conscious mind cannot, finding patterns and meanings that elude deliberate analysis but emerge in dreams where Jacques de Molay walks past the Colosseum discussing banking with Father Benedetto, while Friday the 13th repeats eternally in the background. And whether any of that makes sense doesn't really matter, because sleep doesn't require sense, just permission to let go of the need for everything to have clear explanations and satisfying conclusions.